A fairly common question that I've gotten in the comments of some of my videos is what is the responsibility that a developer has towards the IP that they are using? And what does a faithful adaptation even look like? I have a feeling that this isn't going to be a super satisfying answer to a lot of people, but let's explore this topic. To get the first question out of the way, what is the responsibility of a developer to the IP that they are adapting? At the end of the day, the answer to that question is there's no responsibility. They can do whatever their license allows them to do. If they want to make a Shadowrun game that has none of the components of Shadowrun, they are probably within their rights to do so. But of course, there's consequences that comes with that. At some point, if you are sufficiently different than the IP that you are using, not only are you gaining no benefit from the IP, you're actually getting detriment. Because what you're going to do is bring in nobody. If you make a Star Wars game that is set in a magical world of talking ponies, you are not gaining the benefit of your Star Wars IP, and you are radicalizing the existing Star Wars community against your property. So while there may be no requirement that you not make a talking magical pony game set in the Star Wars universe, you probably don't want to do that. So what does it take to be an accurate representation of an IP? The unfortunate thing that I've seen across a lot of adaptations in recent years is a sort of checklist mentality. If we are making a superhero game, then we're going to get as many cameos from as many other superheroes as we possibly can. If this superhero has a catchphrase, he's going to say that catchphrase. We're going to show his special shoes and maybe even do a little sub arc about how he gets his shoes. And I think the reason that we've seen this proliferation of adaptation is that the online discourse about media has become hyper obsessed with this kind of discussion when it comes to media in general. Things like CinemaSins go through a movie and list the 100 minor inconsistencies or stupid things that exist in a movie. But that's not really what makes a movie good or bad. That's just a bunch of pedantic minutia that is easy to talk about online. And similarly, when it comes to adaptation, a true adaptation, an accurate adaptation, an adaptation that feels right, isn't about the minutia. It isn't about a checklist that you have to complete to be a correct adaptation. But that checklist is the easiest thing to discuss when it comes to whether or not it's a true adaptation. So the conversation becomes bogged down in this conversation. This game doesn't have enough lightsabers. It's not a Star Wars game. This game changed the way that droids work in a tiny, insignificant way. It's not a Star Wars game. And unfortunately, that has become the conversation that dominates these discussions. Whereas I think that what really defines whether or not an adaptation is true to the source material is much more vibes-based, which isn't super satisfying because it's hard to discuss, but it is more true to the reality. When I look at something like the Orville, which is not a Star Trek property at all, for me at least, hits the vibes of Star Trek The Next Generation stronger than anything else that's come out in recent years. And there's been a lot of Star Trek stuff in recent years, and the Orville feels more like Next Generation than anything else that's come out in the last more than a decade. And you might disagree with that, and that's, of course, fine. And that's, I think, the problem that we're having with this conversation. It's very easy for me to say, well, the Orville doesn't have a holodeck or warp drives or Klingons, so obviously it's not a Star Trek show. But it's much harder to discuss the vibes, the feeling, the tone, the overall themes that make it feel like a Star Trek The Next Generation show. We're sort of stuck where we are, where online discourse is pulling things apart and picking away at the minutia and preventing a conversation about whether or not something feels right. And some corporations have kind of figured this out. They figured out that they can short circuit criticism of their property if they throw in enough references and enough stuff to fill out that checklist. If they make that checklist sufficiently long, it removes one of the vectors of criticism. Part of the other problem is that vibes, feels right, is something that comes out of the property as a whole. The vibes that come through from a trailer or from the first 10 minutes of an experience are weaker than what comes through a longer engagement with the property. And the content mill demands quick content. So you get people pulling apart a trailer, again going back into that minutia, and then often the complaints they had go away because the ultimate piece of media actually has the vibes they were hoping for. So they were mad about Princess Peach wearing a jumpsuit in the trailer for the Mario movie, and then it turns out actually they really liked the vibes of what they got at the end of the day, and all that criticism kind of fades away. So we live in this world where media is subject to this outrage culture where any crack, any ability to pull something down is taken because it feeds the algorithm and it generates more views. To be clear, a bunch of this is pretty disingenuous. This is easy content to make. It can generate a ton of views. It's pretty easy to defend a checklist of things that don't fit the IP, at least within your little rage bubble. It often doesn't matter what you actually believe if you can generate sufficient anger with a listicle of clickbait. Am I saying that your favorite rage baity content creator is lying to you? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That they may not believe what they're saying. They may be saying that simply because it's an easy way to generate traffic. But in the process, we've lost a more nuanced conversation about the quality of a piece of media and the faithfulness of it, again, from the perspective of how it feels to the people viewing it. And of course, that's not an objective conversation to have, but we really need to relearn the ability to have conversations about things that aren't fully objective. It isn't all about listing off all the ways that this thing violates the canon of Star Wars or the Forgotten Realms. It's about the ultimate piece of media and how it ends up feeling to the audience that it's targeting. Finally, something that can be hard to remember is that properties need to be in a constant state of evolution. If an IP stays completely static, then it starts to age out and it starts to only appeal to its existing audience, and usually a increasingly shrinking subset of that audience. While you ideally want your adaptation, your next piece of media to appeal to your existing audience, you also want to keep it relevant to new audiences that are coming in. A good way to have a property slowly shrivel up and die is to not allow it to evolve, not allow it to reflect the fact that the world changes, that the attitudes and expectations of the populace at large change. And if you refuse to have your IP move and adapt to that changing landscape, you find yourself becoming ever more niche as the conversation continues to move on. If you change too quickly, you can alienate that core audience. And any change is going to alienate some of that core audience. So the trick for an IP that is going to grow is to evolve, to remain relevant in a way that is acceptable to as much of that existing audience as possible, while drawing in an ever-growing new audience that becomes part of that core. If you don't move at all, then you slowly bleed away your existing audience and you don't bring in anyone new. If you evolve too quickly, you run the risk of alienating a larger percentage of your existing audience and potentially not even drawing in the new audience that you were hoping to. So it's an art, it's a bit of luck in order to thread this needle in order to keep your IP moving. So where is that line? It's dependent upon the IP to a large degree. For really small IPs, you can be really dependent on that core, which can prevent you from changing because you can't afford to upset any of that core. And for a lot of IPs, that's going to be to their detriment in the long term because they're trapped within this relatively small bubble where they have to serve their core to the exclusion of potentially bringing in anyone new. And as people from that core wander away for whatever reason, their reach gets smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they disappear. For larger IPs, that size can sometimes allow them to be more flexible because they are throwing a bit more weight around. They're not as dependent upon a tiny, relatively ossified core. They have more flexibility to experiment, to evolve, to continue to keep their IP fresh. This is what it is to make new pieces of media using an existing IP. You have to change. You have to keep the vibe of what your property represents. And to some degree, you do have to fill in that checklist. You do have to show Wolverine's yellow suit to check that checkbox to show that you're being true to what has come before. It's not an easy conversation, and I suspect that this is not going to be the answer that people were hoping to get from me. I imagine what was being hoped for was that teams have to be rigidly faithful to the stuff that has come before and never allow any deviation, which is not what I believe, and I don't think it is healthy for the IP either. It's not easy. It's not easy to do adaptation. It's not easy to make sequels because you need to change the right amount while maintaining a path to your past. And that path isn't always going to be clear to all of the people that were with you before. And you're going to lose some people each step you take because for some people, that thing you didn't bring forward was the thing that defined the series for them. And so you end up having conversations like this, where you are having to talk about what an adaptation is. So what does a team have to do when they are making a sequel, making an adaptation? They can do whatever they want, but deviating too much has its own consequences. Additionally, a true adaptation is much more about vibes than it is about a checklist of things that must be done. And IPs need to continue to evolve to maintain their relevancy. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there will be a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you are more comfortable with something like that. And we have merch. This is the Control the Triage, Control the Project t-shirt, and this is the High Tea on the High Seas hoodie. They will be linked in the video if you're interested in picking something like that up. Do you think I'm full of crap? Is this not how you think of adaptations and sequels at all? Do you think it's gotta be perfectly the same as the thing that came before? That any evolution, any change is anathema to the brand that this is using? I don't agree with you, but if you want to make that argument, go ahead and do so in the comments. What are some IPs that you've seen adapted in very aggressive ways and it worked out? Let's talk about that in the comments as well. I will see you again soon. Thank you.